Jon Snow stood on the battlements of the Red Keep, listening to the distant hush of kings landing at twilight. From where he stood, he could see the Blackwater rush glimmer in the fading light and the sprawl of narrow streets leading up to the city gates. The air was tinged with ash, though only faintly now. In his memories, however, the stench was still overpowering. The smell of charred flesh, blasted stone, and the acrid tang of dragonfire. He shifted his weight, one gloved hand resting on the cold stone parapet, and let out a quiet breath. Though the city was no longer burning, ghosts of the past still prowled among the ruined corners of his mind. If he closed his eyes, he could hear the screams of innocence, see Drogon's fiery wrath. Yet here he was, almost by chance or destiny, a man who once knew nothing, now burdened by a secret that threatened to devour him whole. He was Aegon Targaryen, born of Rhaegar and Lyanna, last male heir to House Targaryen. Yet how heavy that name felt upon his shoulders. Even after he had learned the truth of his parentage, it had not felt real. He had grown up a Stark, believing Ned to be his father, the product of some unknown liaison. In the dark nights of the Wall, he had imagined his mother as a tavern wench, or perhaps a fisherman's daughter. Truth had proven more extraordinary and more treacherous than any dream. And now, the realm demanded something more from him than his sword. It demanded leadership. It demanded reconciliation. His small, private hope was that it might also, in some remote possibility, offer him a chance for peace. He stepped down from the battlement, making his way through a torchlit corridor. A pair of unsullied guards stood by the entrance to the Queen's, the King's council chamber. They did not hinder his passage, merely straightened at attention with the silent discipline that characterized them. He nodded in return. Even so, a pang of guilt twisted in him when he recalled the deaths of so many of their brothers on foreign shores. The tyranny that followed once Daenerys Targaryen's grief and ambition grew unshackled. She had believed so fervently in her destiny that any who stood in her way must have seemed an enemy. He wondered if she would hate him now for what he was about to do. He opened the heavy wooden door and entered the chamber. It was a long, cavernous space, lit by candles and a roaring fireplace. The table at its center was not the polished slab of oak that had graced this room in the days of the Mad King. That table had been smashed during the sacking of King's Landing by Tywin Lannister's forces, years past. This one was plainer, rectangular, recently fashioned from local lumber. Yet its surface was wide enough to seat the lords of the major houses who had responded to Jon's summons. And that was what mattered. He was not here to mimic the grandeur of old Targaryen kings. He was here to gather the realm's power brokers and unify them in a common cause, to bring order and stability, to avoid plunging Westeros into another cataclysmic war. Above all, he wanted to create a future free from the cruelties of tyranny. One by one, the lords and ladies of Westeros had begun to arrive in the city over the past fortnight. The negotiations had been complicated and wrought with suspicion. Many had come because they had no clear alternative. Others had come because the last round of chaos had nearly destroyed them, and they had no stomach for more. The memory of dragonfire still blackened the city walls. The charred remains of the Great September and the Red Keep's battered towers offered an unspoken threat. War could always return, and it would be worse the next time. Jon had extended olive branches, pardoned past betrayals, and promised positions of influence to those who would join him in forging a new future. He had explained his lineage to a small group of trusted advisors, though he had not yet declared it publicly. Many in the realm still believed him simply to be the king in the north who had come south to fight the Night King, or perhaps just a lord or warden who'd had a fleeting claim to the Iron Throne through conquest and moral ascendancy. But soon they would all know the truth, and this council would be his shield against the lords who might oppose him for fear of a new Targaryen tyranny. Jon took his seat at the head of the table, an unadorned chair. Gone were the ornate dragon motifs or the Baroque carvings of older Targaryen monarchs. He insisted on simplicity. He wore stark black, the only ornament being a silver direwolf sigil pinned to his left breast. He had not fully abandoned the Stark identity that had shaped him, even as he wrestled with the Targaryen blood that stirred within. He suspected that the true measure of who he was would be in his decisions, his alliances, and his willingness to forge a better path. His name alone, no matter how storied, would not suffice. He had learned long ago that honor and choices meant more than birth. Around him, the highborn seated themselves slowly. There was Sansa Stark, cloaked in northern gray and white furs, her hair a fiery auburn cascade over her shoulders. She regarded the assembly with a steady, measured gaze. Across from her sat Tyrion Lannister, whose sharp eyes flicked around the table with perpetual calculation. The events of the past months had etched deep lines into his face. He wore no pin of hand. Jon had not formally named a hand yet, but Tyrion remained an invaluable advisor. His knowledge of court dynamics, the layout of the city, and the intricacies of how each house vied for power were all assets that Jon believed he could not do without. Near Tyrion sat Brienne of Tarth, not a highborn lord in the sense of holding a great seat, but a knight of the Kingsguard. Jon's newly formed Kingsguard, if he could dare call it that, though the final structure of it was still uncertain. She radiated integrity, her posture as upright as her moral code. Her eyes were focused, scanning the gathering for any potential threat. Close by, Ser Davos Seaworth rested his hands on the table, calloused and weathered by a life spent on the sea. His presence reminded Jon of those quiet pieces of advice that had saved him more than once, even if Davos never claimed to be a politician. On the opposite side, Yara Greyjoy drummed her fingers, her short hair framing a face that was equal parts impatience and determination. She had arrived from the Iron Islands only days earlier, guided by a new sense of obligation to the realm, or perhaps a desire to ensure that her own domain did not fall prey to a southern threat again. Alongside her sat Gendry Baratheon, the bastard-born son of Robert Baratheon, who had been legitimized in the wave of changes that followed the war against the White Walkers. He looked mildly uncomfortable in such high company, but he was eager to honor the memory of his father in some meaningful way. Though the Baratheon line had dwindled, Gendry was prepared to fight for his recognition as Lord of Storm's End, even if his hold on the seat was tenuous. Representing the Vale was Lord Robin Arryn, taller now and somewhat more composed after being guided in his early adulthood by Lord Royce and others. He still had an air of fragility around him, a sense that if the winds of politics blew too fiercely, he might be knocked over. Near him was Lord Royce himself, whose solid presence gave some measure of stability to House Arryn's voice. From the Riverlands, Edmure Tully had arrived with a subdued retinue. He appeared anxious, aware that his previous missteps had made him the subject of some derision. But he bore the Tully sigil with pride, determined to keep Riverrun stable and recognized in whatever new order arose. The Stormlands, Dorne, the Reach, those seats had become complicated after the wars. Tarly had a tenuous grasp on the Reach after the destruction of House Tyrell. The Dornish had sent a delegation of lesser nobles, the last known royals and princes having died in the earlier conflicts. The seat of power in Sunspear was in flux, and so the representatives from Dorne were a collection of minor lords attempting to unify behind a single voice. The mixture of so many uncertain claims and fresh ambitions gave the council room an electric tension, and it was in that swirl of energies that Jon Snow hoped to forge an alliance that could outlast the petty squabbles of centuries past. Jon cleared his throat, and the room stilled. Firelight danced on the faces of great lords, ladies, knights, and counselors. A hush fell across them, and in the quiet moment, Jon was acutely aware of the magnitude of what he was about to say. He had fought White Walkers, whites, and men who bore steel with murderous intent. Yet, in this moment, the fear was different. He feared the cost of failure. "My lords and ladies," he began, voice carrying through the chamber. "Thank you for coming here. I know for some of you it was no small risk. The city still bears scars, and many of you have lost dearly in the conflicts that plagued us these past few years. I do not pretend that wounds will heal easily, but I ask that you hear me out. Our realm stands at a crossroads. We have fought off the Night King, we have ended the war that once threatened to tear us apart, and now we have an opportunity to rebuild. Together." He paused, catching Sansa's gaze for a moment. She offered him a faint nod, encouraging him to continue. Around the table, expressions ranged from cautious interest to outright skepticism. Lord Royce's thick brows were furrowed, while Yara Greyjoy leaned forward as if daring Jon to say something that might pique her sense of loyalty or her cynicism. "Many of you know me as Jon Snow," he said. "The man who was raised as Ned Stark's son, the man who took the Black, the man who was named king in the North. But there is more to my story, and it is time that I share it openly." Here, his breath caught in his throat, the weight of history pressing down on him. "I am Aegon Targaryen, the son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark." A murmur spread through the room, some of it shock, some of it scorn, and some of it weary acceptance. In truth, the rumor had circulated in hushed corners, but hearing Jon himself proclaim it lent a gravity that could not be easily dismissed. "I did not seek out this truth," Jon continued in a calmer voice than he felt, "and I did not wish to rule. But circumstances have led us here. The Targaryen line has been whittled down to few, and the realm has suffered greatly under the tyranny of those who believed might makes right. My own ally, Daenerys, believed she was destined to break the wheel. Yet in the end, she nearly broke the realm. I will not apologize for the good she did, but I cannot defend her crimes. I had to act to stop further bloodshed. That action brought me to this place, forced to claim a legacy I never asked for." He let out a slow exhale. "I wish to propose a new system, one that draws from our ancient traditions of lords and ladies ruling their lands, but united under a single banner for the good of all. I cannot, in good conscience, claim absolute power. That path is fraught with danger, as we have seen too many times. But if my parentage grants me legitimacy, then let me use it to form a Regency Council, led by the major houses, to rule alongside me. Together, we can rebuild King's Landing, restore prosperity, and avert the tragedies of the past." By the time he finished, the low susurrus of conversation had begun anew. His words were a carefully measured proposition that Tyrion had helped him craft. He spoke from the heart but tried to keep to the structure they had agreed on. He knew how precarious this was. If these houses refused to cooperate, if they denounced him, the realm could splinter again. And if they believed he was simply forging a puppet council to hide his true intention of becoming another autocratic Targaryen, no one would be safe. Tyrion cleared his throat. "Our king, a rightful king if we accept the blood claim, offers to share power, not hoard it. This is not the way of previous Targaryens, nor is it the way of the usurper who burned this city. It is a new way, a compromise. We all have lost people we loved. We have all been wounded by fire and steel. Here is a chance to forge something better." Yara spoke next. "And how do we know this isn't just a ploy? The Greyjoys bent the knee to Aegon the Conqueror once, and we remember what followed. The Iron Islands have never been good thralls. Are we to surrender ourselves again to the might of dragons? Or is this promise of a council real?" Jon met her eyes, recognizing in them the defiance of one who had seen loved ones killed in foreign wars. "The promise is real," he said. "I learned long ago that people do not wish to be ruled by fear. Those who do such a thing become the very monsters they claim to fight. I will not be that. If any among you suspect my motives, test me. Ask for the changes you deem necessary. If I rule alone, it will lead only to further suspicion, and that is the last thing the realm needs." Yara chewed her lip, then nodded with a grunt. It was not full acceptance, but it was an acknowledgement that she would give him a chance to prove himself. From there, the meeting devolved into more pointed debates. Some lords questioned the legality of Jon's claim, wanting to see written proof of Rhaegar's annulment and subsequent remarriage. Others worried about the precedent of a Targaryen returning to the throne after so many years of war to rid themselves of that dynasty. Yet, the memory of Daenerys' final days, culminating in her death at Jon's own hand, weighed heavily enough that fear of open rebellion kept most from outright rejecting him. In the end, the conversation trailed into the late hours of the evening. They agreed in principle to the formation of a Regency Council, composed of representatives from each major region, but the specifics were left unresolved. That night, Jon returned to the modest chamber he had chosen within the Red Keep. He had refused the lavish royal suite that previous kings had occupied. He wanted no illusions of grandeur, no parade of sycophants or new tapestries designed to glorify the Targaryen return. Instead, he settled for a smaller set of rooms near the old Maegor's holdfast, ones that overlooked a courtyard still strewn with rubble from the final battle. Grey Worm and the Unsullied had departed for Noth soon after the conclusion of the war, leaving Jon to secure the city with a skeleton force of Northmen and city watch. He knew that, in time, if trust and resources allowed, each region could dispatch men to help keep King's Landing safe. But that was a dream for the future. A single torch flickered in his chamber. He peeled off his gloves and tossed them on a small table, then sat heavily on a wooden bench by the window. His sword, Longclaw, lay propped against the wall. He stared at it, remembering Jeor Mormont's gift and all the battles he had fought with it. A Targaryen with a Valyrian steel blade of House Mormont. A strange marriage of symbols. It reminded him of how the old ways were being forged into new shapes, a melding of histories that might either unify the realm or tear it apart further. The door opened quietly, and Sansa entered. She carried a candle in her hand, her dress rustling softly against the stone floor. She closed the door behind her and crossed the room. Jon rose to greet her, but she motioned for him to remain seated. She set the candle down, then placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "I thought you might be brooding," she said softly. "You've always had that habit." He allowed himself a wry smile. "I suppose I have." She sat on the bench beside him, careful not to let her dress catch the flame of the candle. "That was a monumental step," she said, "revealing your parentage. I remember how stunned I was when I first learned it. This isn't easy for you." "No," Jon admitted. "It's not easy for anyone, but they have to know the truth if they're going to trust me. If I claimed the throne simply as Jon Snow, it would be hollow. There would be too many rumors, too much gossip. Let them see that I have nothing to hide." She nodded, her eyes fixed on the faint glow of torchlight from the corridor. "House Stark still stands behind you as we always have. We may share blood, but I want you to know that my loyalty isn't just because of that. I believe you're doing what's right." He squeezed her hand. "Thank you, Sansa." She bowed her head, her voice dropping even lower. "But be wary. There are some who will see your Targaryen blood and only remember madness, dragons, and war. You must show them that you are different through patience and fairness. And we must secure alliances, real alliances, not just token gestures." "I know." His gaze turned back to the distant lights of the city, many of them winking out as people retired for the night. "We'll have to start by appeasing the greatest threats. If the major houses agree to serve on this council, if we ensure they all have a voice, we can hold the realm together. From there, we can address trade, reconstruction, the scars left by war. Perhaps, in time, we can achieve real peace." Sansa stood, smoothing the folds of her dress. "Rest, Jon. Tomorrow you'll need your strength. These lords will test you and push you. You'll have Tyrion and Davos at your side, and me as well. We can do this if we stand together." Jon nodded, though the knot in his stomach did not unravel. After Sansa left, he stared at the candle flame until it flickered out, and then he sat alone in the dark, weighed down by the knowledge that the burden of a Targaryen name was not easily cast aside. The following days were filled with negotiations. The formation of the Regency Council, in concept, was not complicated. Each major region or kingdom of Westeros would send a representative to King's Landing. That representative would have a seat and a voice in the governance of the realm. The king, Jon, would serve as a figure of unity, a final arbiter when consensus could not be reached, but he would not have unchecked authority. Furthermore, the council would draft a set of guidelines or charters that limited royal prerogative, ensuring that future monarchs could not repeat the crimes of the Mad King or, for that matter, the fiery devastation of Daenerys. In practice, however, hammering out the details proved as exhausting as any long campaign. Jon spent hours in the council chamber, flanked by Tyrion, Davos, and Sansa, who each played a vital role in smoothing out disputes. Lord Yohn Royce was particularly vocal in ensuring that the Vale's voice not be overshadowed by more populous regions such as the Reach or the West. Edmure Tully, trying to regain the esteem he had lost over the years, insisted on certain protections for smaller houses within the Riverlands and demanded a formal recognition of Riverlord autonomy. Dorne's representatives, led by a stern-faced noblewoman named Lady Maria Toland, were most wary of Targaryen rule and wanted explicit clauses preventing the crown from raising a foreign army or imposing heavy tributes. Yara Greyjoy and Gendry Baratheon found themselves forming an unlikely alliance of mutual caution. The Iron Islands had always been rebellious, and the Stormlands had lost much during the wars, leaving them underpopulated and under-resourced. Yet they both eyed the sea lanes with an interest in trade and shipping control, which led to arguments with the merchants of Oldtown who were now partially under the Tarly influence. Meanwhile, the West was represented by a cousin of Tyrion's, some distant Lannister who had survived the bloody purges that took place after Cersei's defeat, who took every opportunity to assert that the Lannisters were still a mighty house worthy of respect. At times, tensions flared. On one late afternoon, Yara nearly stormed out when the topic of the new royal fleet arose, as she believed her people should oversee any maritime force. Lord Royce retorted that the Vale also had ships, and that perhaps a more neutral approach was needed. The argument escalated until Tyrion rose and proposed that the realm's ships be divided into smaller fleets, each commanded by a coalition of captains from multiple regions. That solution was neither elegant nor certain, but it kept the meeting from disintegrating. Jon himself spoke sparingly, mostly to urge unity or to clarify the broad vision of the council. He was not skilled at the verbal jousting that came naturally to some of the others, but he tried to remain calm and resolute, reinforcing that he was not seeking to impose new burdens on the lords, only to formalize an arrangement that would benefit everyone. Once or twice, he evoked the memory of the Night King and the terror that nearly consumed them all. "Remember," he said softly, "that we stood side by side at Winterfell, Northerners ironborn, Knights of the Vale unsullied, Dothraki, men from the Stormlands. We all fought a foe that did not care for titles or claims. Do we really want to descend back into petty squabbles that will see Westeros weakened if another threat arises?" Tyrion's eyes glimmered with a hint of approval at that. It was a technique used by cunning statesmen, reminding everyone of a common enemy or a recent catastrophe to instill cooperation. Yet Jon spoke from the heart. He truly feared that the realm's unity might fracture, and the memory of that cold, dead night still haunted his dreams. Though each day was rife with disagreements, little by little, the shape of the Regency Council became clearer. 7 seats, 1 for each region. North, Vale, Stormlands, Reach, Westerlands, Riverlands, and Dorne, plus Jon as king, making 8 voices in total. The Iron Islands would be folded in with the North for the sake of representation, though Yara would hold a special authority regarding maritime affairs. This compromise was not perfect, and Sansa bristled privately at the notion of the North seat having to share authority with the Iron Islands, but for the sake of peace, she did not contest it openly. The charter itself would limit the king's ability to raise new taxes without council approval, declare war without a council majority, or revoke noble titles on a whim. In exchange, each region agreed to maintain a small standing force in King's Landing to act as a royal guard. No single region's troops would dominate the city. The concept of roving justice was also proposed, something akin to the old Targaryen tradition of the king's justice, but with multiple justiciars appointed from various regions to ensure fair trials. These ideas and more were scribbled onto parchment, revised, argued over, and then revised again. New tensions arose daily, often over matters that seemed trivial compared to the wars they had fought. Details of trade routes, fishing rights, or the boundaries of lesser lordships. In the grand scheme, these were small matters, yet they carried symbolic weight. Who had the right to oversee the fields near the Blackwater? Should the city watch be commanded by a King's Landing native or by a rotation of officers from the major houses? Jon found himself exhausted by the labyrinth of details, but he persisted because the alternative was chaos. Meanwhile, the city itself began a slow process of recovery. The charred remains of buildings destroyed by dragonfire were torn down, and new construction began. Workers hauled debris, mended walls, and repaired gates. The smell of smoke lingered, and more than a few masses of scorched stone remained as silent memorials to the brutality unleashed upon King's Landing. Yet, for the first time in years, there was a cautious optimism among the people. The markets reopened, albeit with fewer stalls and goods. The docks bustled with fishing boats bringing fresh catches. Some taverns rang with a subdued cheer, as though the city were collectively holding its breath, unsure whether peace would last. Jon made a point of walking among the people when he could. He traveled with only a small retinue, Brienne, Davos, and a handful of northern guards. He passed out coin to beggars and listened to their tales of loss. He conferred with blacksmiths and stonemasons, learning what tools and resources they needed from the crown. He visited an orphanage near Flea Bottom, established by the faith to care for children whose parents had perished in the war. He found himself particularly moved by those children's hollow eyes, reminded of his own uncertain childhood, never quite belonging. He vowed privately to ensure that the realm's new treasury would allocate funds to help them. Sansa called these excursions vital for building trust. Tyrion noted they were good optics. People like to see a king who cares. Jon did not care about the optics. He simply felt a moral obligation to stand with the citizens who had been so battered by events beyond their control. Perhaps his presence would show them that not all Targaryens sought to subjugate them with flame and blood. The first major moment of unity came when the Dornish delegation agreed to sign the preliminary draft of the council charter. Lady Maria Toland and her advisors, after many hours locked in discussion with Tyrion, Sansa, and some local merchants, agreed that the limitations on royal authority and the recognition of each region's autonomy were sufficient to protect Dorne's interests. "We were never comfortable under the Iron Throne," Lady Maria said, "and too many times have we fought to retain our independence. If this new arrangement respects our rights, we will stand behind it." With Dorne on board, others fell into place more easily. Yara Greyjoy demanded an addendum regarding the Iron Islands, ensuring they could continue their maritime traditions without forced interference. Gendry Baratheon asked for a reaffirmation of his claim to Storm's End, which was granted. House Tarly, struggling to rebuild the Reach after the annihilation of House Tyrell, negotiated favorable trade deals to bring in foodstuffs and skilled labor to restore farmland ravaged by war. The Westerlands, still under the Lannister banner, bickered over gold mines and the distribution of taxes, but ultimately found themselves with little leverage. The near-complete ruin of House Lannister's fortunes left them in no position to dictate terms as they once had. Even so, there was an undercurrent of grumbling from various corners. Some muttered that a Targaryen was on the throne again, and eventually he would show his true colors. Others whispered that perhaps a different claimant might arise, some rumored descendant of Rhael Targaryen, or a hidden Blackfyre lineage, or something else entirely. But these were the quiet rumblings of gossip, lacking real momentum now that the council was well underway. The lords and ladies were simply too exhausted by warfare to entertain more bloodshed unless absolutely forced. After nearly 2 moons of negotiations, the day came for a formal ceremony. The Red Keep's throne room, still bearing the scars of dragonfire and battle, was draped with new banners, black with the 3-headed dragon of House Targaryen, alongside smaller banners representing each major region. The floor had been scrubbed of ash, though scorch marks remained near the edges. The Iron Throne itself was still there, hammered together from the swords of Aegon's enemies centuries before, its sharp metal edges glinting in the torchlight. Jon felt a surge of conflicting emotion as he regarded it. So many had died for that seat of power. Kings had gone mad upon it. Queens had burned cities for it. And now he stood as a Targaryen who sought to diminish its singular authority. He wore black leather and a simple cloak, clasped at the shoulder with a silver wolf's head, a nod to his Stark upbringing. No crown adorned his head yet, though Tyrion had presented him with an offer to fashion a new one. Jon refused, at least for now. The lords and ladies arrayed themselves in the hall. Sansa, Tyrion, Brienne, Davos, Yara, Gendry, Edmure, Lord Royce, Lady Maria, the Tarly representative, and others of note. A hush fell over the gathered crowd of lesser nobles, knights, and city folk who had been admitted to witness the event. Tyrion stepped forward to address the assembly. "We have endured much," he began. "The realm was saved from a threat beyond the living. We survived civil wars, betrayals, and the violent uprooting of old regimes. Many of us have lost mothers, fathers, siblings, children. The scars upon this city and upon our hearts may never fully heal. Yet we stand here today to proclaim a new era. King Jon, first of his name, though some call him Aegon, has proclaimed that the Iron Throne shall no longer be the instrument of a single tyrant's will. We gather to witness the creation of a Regency Council, a bond of unity among the great houses. Each region shall have its say, each region shall share in the burdens of governance, and none shall hold sway over the others without consent. He unrolled a parchment, reading out the official articles of the council, the powers of the king, the powers of each region's delegate, the limitations set upon the monarchy, the conditions under which decisions could be made or vetoed. The words echoed through the throne room, a litany of compromise that might have seemed tedious were it not for the emotional weight of the moment. Each region's representative stood in turn to confirm their acceptance, each proclaiming a short vow to uphold the charter. Finally, Tyrion turned to Jon. "Your Grace," he said, "if you will confirm before all gathered here that you, as king, accept these conditions, we may proceed." Jon stepped forward, glancing at the throng of faces, both hopeful and guarded. He inhaled, letting the memory of the cold wind on the wall fill him, reminding him of his old vow to protect the realms of men. "I, Jon of the houses Stark and Targaryen, do hereby swear to uphold this charter, to govern not by fear but in accordance with the will of this council, for the betterment of all Westeros. Let the mistakes of my forebears guide us away from tyranny. I shall serve the realm as its guardian, not as its master." A murmuring ripple passed through the crowd. He sensed relief in some faces, anxiety in others. In that moment, he felt the presence of ghosts. Ned Stark, who had taught him about honor. Rhaegar Targaryen, the father he never knew. Daenerys, whose fervor led to destruction. He felt them all standing in judgment. With those words, the Regency Council was born. It was an act of bridging the North and the South, Targaryen and Stark, conquerors and conquered. Whether it would stand the test of time was another question entirely. A small cluster of artisans came forward with a new banner. The combined sigils of Stark and Targaryen, a direwolf and three-headed dragon side by side, signifying the union of histories. It was a bit too grand for Jon's taste, but it held symbolic weight. As the banner was unfurled and hung beside the Iron Throne, the crowd broke into polite applause. Jon noticed many in the crowd wore expressions of tempered hope. In the weeks that followed, the council convened regularly to address pressing matters. They arranged for grain shipments from the Reach to be distributed to war-torn areas of the Riverlands, with Tully envoys overseeing fair prices and ensuring no region would profit unfairly from the devastation of another. Brienne traveled between the Vale and the North, meeting with lords to confirm their acceptance of the new order. Yara sailed back to Pike for a short time, promising to bring more ships to King's Landing to aid in reconstruction efforts along the coast. Lord Royce returned to the Eyrie, confident that the Vale's voice was now secure in the capital's decisions. The city itself buzzed with renewed activity. While mistrust still simmered in pockets, the sense of immediate crisis had passed. Pilgrims arrived from the countryside, seeking to pray in the remains of the Great September or to find work rebuilding the city. Merchants haggled over the price of timber and stone, and taverns found themselves once more hosting travelers from across Westeros. The Red Keep's forges clanged with blacksmiths crafting new gates and armaments, not for war, but for protecting trade routes and city walls. Jon spent much of his time arbitrating disputes. He listened to arguments between lords over boundaries, oversaw the distribution of coin to refugees, and wrote letters to distant corners of the realm, urging them to send delegates to the new council. He tried to remain humble and approachable, though Tyrion often reminded him that as king, he had to maintain some mystique. Jon could not help who he was. The trappings of power still made him uncomfortable. Nevertheless, he accepted that wearing the mantle of authority might be necessary if the realm was to hold together. One day, as he walked the corridors of the Red Keep, he encountered Samwell Tarly, now dressed in the robes of a maester in training. Sam had been poring over old tomes in the Keep's library, searching for any precedent for the kind of shared governance Jon was enacting. Jon greeted him warmly, relieved to see a friendly face that reminded him of simpler times at Castle Black. Sam grinned, though the weight of knowledge glinted in his eyes. "Jon," he said, forgetting protocol, "I've come across something interesting in the old records. When the Undulls invaded, some local kings set up councils of war. They had the lords swear pacts of mutual defense. It didn't always work, but sometimes it held peace for a few decades at a time. There's even an example of a Regency council in the north, back when a child ruled Winterfell." Jon raised an eyebrow. "Do you think it'll help us now?" Sam shrugged. "History rarely repeats perfectly, but we can learn from it. I think the biggest challenge is ensuring that no single lord or region accumulates too much power at the expense of others. This council you've formed, it's a good start, but it will require vigilance. The moment someone sees an opportunity to seize control, they might." Jon nodded. "I know. That's why I'm trying to give them all a stake in the outcome. If they're invested in the council, they have less reason to break it." Sam looked at him with earnest respect. "It's a noble idea. Maybe the best shot Westeros has had in a long time." They shared a quiet smile, both recalling the days at Castle Black when they had worried about little more than how to keep warm or how to avoid the wrath of Ser Alliser Thorne. The responsibilities they carried now were worlds apart from those simpler concerns. Time marched on, and the Regency Council settled into a rhythm. Major issues were voted on, smaller ones were delegated. Jon found himself constantly juggling the demands of the North, where he was still revered as a Stark, and the legacy of House Targaryen in King's Landing. Sansa returned to Winterfell briefly to ensure the North remained supportive of the new arrangement, while Tyrion managed the day-to-day affairs of the city's bureaucracy with a cynical wit that kept lesser officials in line. Davos oversaw the restoration of docks and shipping lanes, forging new alliances with the narrow sea merchants. Gendry worked tirelessly to expand blacksmithing guilds, hoping to create a new generation of skilled armorers and builders. They received an emissary from Braavos, who was curious about the shift in power within Westeros. Jon handled the meeting with caution, mindful that the Iron Bank would scrutinize any possibility of profit or debt repayment. He assured the emissary that the realm, under the Regency Council, intended to honor all legitimate debts incurred by previous rulers, though the bank's representatives seemed skeptical. Nonetheless, Braavos did not appear eager to fund rebellions or splinter factions. Stability was often more profitable. One evening, after a grueling session of the council, Jon walked alone through the gardens of the Red Keep. They were slowly being replanted, flowers and shrubs replacing the scorched hedges that had been destroyed. He found a small bench near a fountain that trickled with water. The air was cool, and the sky above was tinged with the purple hues of dusk. The stones beneath his feet still bore a few cracks from when the ground had been shaken by falling rubble during the siege. Even in beauty, the memory of violence lingered. His thoughts wandered to Ghost, his direwolf, who remained in the north. He missed the quiet companionship of that white-furred guardian. He thought of Arya, who had journeyed west of Westeros, forging her own path. He thought of Bran, distant and unreachably entangled in the mysteries of the three-eyed raven. So many of the bonds of his old life were fading away, but perhaps that was the price of shaping a new future for the realm. A footstep behind him made him turn. It was Tyrion, a goblet of wine in hand. He approached, eyeing Jon with curiosity. "You look like a man carrying the weight of the 7 kingdoms on his shoulders," Tyrion said softly, offering the goblet. "Care for some Arbor Red? It's quite decent." Jon shook his head. "I've had enough wine for today, thank you." Tyrion took a sip, then set the goblet down on the fountain's ledge, dusting off his tunic. "Council sessions are going smoother, but I can see it on your face. This is not what you wanted, is it?" Jon glanced at the swirling water in the fountain. "I wanted to protect people from the dead. Then I wanted to protect people from tyranny. Now I'm trying to protect them from themselves, from their own greed and ambition. Sometimes I wonder if I'm any different from Daenerys. She believed she was doing what was right. She thought she was breaking the wheel. But in the end..." "You are different," Tyrion said emphatically. "Daenerys had good intentions, but she was consumed by the certainty of her own righteousness. You, on the other hand, are burdened by doubt, which is precisely why you're less likely to repeat her mistakes. It's the men and women who do not question themselves that we must fear. Jon managed a faint smile. Thank you, Tyrion. They sat in companionable silence for a while, the trickle of water in the fountain mingling with the distant sounds of the city. Finally, Tyrion cleared his throat. I believe we've done something extraordinary here. A Targaryen on the throne who does not crave absolute power. A council of lords once at war with each other now sitting together to govern. It's tenuous, but it's real. If this lasts, it may transform Westeros. Jon nodded slowly. I hope so, but if it fails, it could plunge the realm back into bloodshed. Yes, Tyrion replied, his voice subdued. That is always the risk, but it's better to try, isn't it? We can't let fear of failure keep us from the chance of success. Jon exhaled, gazing up at the first stars that dotted the sky. You're right, we have to try. And so the days became weeks and the weeks became months. The Regency Council gradually earned the cautious respect of the realm. Smaller houses, seeing the council as a forum where their voices might be heard, began sending envoys to petition the king and his counselors. Each petition, from grazing disputes to fishing rights, was heard in turn. Some were dismissed, others were referred to local lords, and some were arbitrated directly when they bore signify. Cants for multiple regions. In the north, Sansa's influence stabilized any concerns that Jon's Targaryen blood might overshadow his Stark identity. In fact, many Northerners took pride in the notion that their king was a bridge between North and South. In the Vale, Lord Royce continued to groom Robin Arryn for a more active role. The boy lord was no longer a child, but he needed guidance in the intricacies of rule. The council gave him a place to observe and learn from older, more seasoned lords. Dorne resumed trade, though they kept a watchful eye on King's Landing, ever mindful of the pain inflicted upon them by Targaryens long ago. But Lady Maria regularly updated Jon on the region's progress, satisfied that the new order did not threaten their autonomy. Meanwhile, construction in King's Landing reached a fevered pace. New houses rose where rubble once lay. The old bells of the city rang more often, sometimes for weddings that signaled a new generation looking to the future rather than the past. Priests of the Seven walked the streets, preaching hope and atonement. Even the remnants of the faith militant had quieted, partly because their figureheads were long gone, partly because the realm no longer tolerated such zealotry. Yet the faith of the people remained, turning to the gods for comfort in these uncertain but promising times. Jon made efforts to strengthen relationships across the sea as well, sending ravens to Essos. He wanted to assure the free cities that Westeros would not embark on reckless expansions or wars. He also reached out to the new Khalasars, those who had scattered after Daenerys' death. That was a more complicated matter. Many of them had returned to the Dothraki Sea, but a few small bands remained near the coasts, uncertain of what to do without their Khaleesi. Jon provided them with ships to return east, hoping to avoid any lingering violence. The memory of Dothraki screams echoing through the streets of King's Landing still haunted many citizens. Throughout all of this, the Iron Throne loomed in the throne room, a physical reminder of the realm's turbulent history. Jon still used it for official ceremonies, as tradition demanded. But he did not linger on it, and sometimes he wondered if they should melt it down entirely, forging new swords for the City Watch or even new plowshares for the farmers. Yet the throne had become a symbol, recognized far and wide, and removing it might spark more unrest than it would quell. So it remained, sharp and cold, while the Regency Council met around a plain wooden table in an adjoining chamber. The arrangement was a metaphor for Jon's rule. The old form was kept for tradition, but the real decisions now sprang from shared power. As the first year of the Regency Council drew to a close, a day of celebration was declared. The city had not had a proper festival in a long time, and though coin was still tight, enough had been saved to hold a modest celebration. Musicians played in the squares, stalls sold freshly baked bread, roasted meats and sweetmeats. Jugglers and mummers performed for children, and the children laughed. A rare sound in a place once ravaged by dragon fire. Jon walked through the celebrations in plain clothes, accompanied by Brienne and Davos. People bowed or curtsied awkwardly upon realizing who he was, but he waved away the formalities. He tasted the sweet wine from the arbor, gave coin to a talented musician, and watched in quiet amazement as children reenacted in playful pantomime the defeat of the White Walkers. In their little play, a figure representing the Night King stumbled about comically, chased away by actors portraying dragons, wolves, and even a lion. It was a whimsical retelling, bearing little resemblance to the grim truth, but it warmed Jon's heart to see that the living memory of that threat was now couched in laughter rather than terror. Near the end of the day, fireworks lit the evening sky, a gift from a group of Pentoshi pyromancers who had traveled across the narrow sea. The bursts of color and light startled Jon at first, reminding him of the chaos of battle, but soon he relaxed and watched the display with a sense of wonder. For a moment, he allowed himself to savor it as a man, not a king. Then he remembered the vow he had taken, to shepherd this realm toward peace, to bear the burden of leadership so that others might live without fear. He did not pretend that all was perfect. There were certainly seeds of future conflict. But for now, Westeros was healing, and that was more than he had dared hope for a year ago. When the festival finally wound down, Jon returned to the Red Keep. He passed through the corridors, nodding greetings to guards who saluted him. In his chambers, he found a letter waiting. Sansa had sent word from Winterfell that the winter snows were easing, that the North's harvest might be plentiful this year if the weather held. That was good news indeed. It meant that soon they might not need emergency shipments from the south just to feed their people. He also found a raven from Tarth, with Brienne's kin expressing gratitude for the stability brought by the council. Tyrion joined him briefly before the night ended, bearing more wine and a scroll of parchment. "We have more claims for minor lordships in the Crownlands," he said. "Everyone sees an opportunity in this new era. We'll have to adjudicate who truly has the right to those lands, which were left vacant after the war." Jon took the scroll, scanning it. "We'll present it to the council tomorrow. They can help sort it out." Tyrion smirked. "I never thought I'd see the day a Targaryen king said those words. We'll present it to the council. You're truly changing how things are done." Jon set the scroll aside. "We are changing things. You, Sansa, Davos, Brienne, everyone on the council. I couldn't do this alone. If I tried, it would fail." Tyrion gave him a respectful bow. "At least you understand that. Many kings never learn such a lesson." He straightened and drained the last of his wine. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need some rest. Tomorrow promises more tedious arguments about fishing rights or some such matter." Left alone, Jon sat by the window, gazing out at the city. Torches flickered along the walls, and he could still hear faint laughter and singing from the streets below. He closed his eyes, allowing himself a rare moment of contentment. The realm was at peace, albeit a fragile one. The Regency Council might not be perfect, but it was a step away from the vicious cycle of absolute monarchs and brutal rebellions. Perhaps, with time, the people could take full ownership of their future, no longer living or dying by the whims of a single ruler. The name Targaryen might yet become something other than a symbol of madness and destruction. And Jon, though he had never asked for this destiny, decided he would see it through. If his existence, a child of ice and fire, could serve as a bridge that kept Westeros united and free from tyranny, then it was a destiny worth embracing. He recalled his old vows of the Night's Watch, to guard the realms of men. That vow never truly left him. It had simply taken on a new shape, and in the quiet stillness of the Red Keep, he made a silent promise to himself. He would do whatever it took to ensure this council thrived, to ensure that peace remained, so that the next generation could inherit a better world. He stayed awake long into the night, planning, reflecting, and listening to the distant, drowsy hum of a city still alive with the hope of a new era. While ravens rested in the rookery, carrying no urgent messages of war, and no banners of revolt darkened the horizon, Jon Snow, Aegon Targaryen, kept watch. He was a king now, but also a man shaped by duty, guided by an unwavering commitment to protect the living. And so, As the moon rose above the spires of the Red Keep, he steeled himself for the challenges yet to come, trusting in the fragile alliance that he had forged. If fate allowed, Westeros would never again bow to a single will, but rather stand together as one.